Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. Really excited. Thank you also for those of you who are online. I see you. I really appreciate it. And today I'm really excited to be talking a lot about my fundamental research that I conduct here at the University of Alberta. And I'm going to be trying to thread the needle the best I can as it comes to sustainability and how resilience is interacting with that. So again, I'm Stephen Wong. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering. I lead the RESUME group, which stands for the Resilient and Sustainable Mobility and Evacuation Group. And we are interested in a variety of different approaches, but really focusing on the key goals and components of building a transportation system that is just, that is resilient, and that is sustainable, particularly from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. So the outline of my presentation today, I'll be covering, well, what is resilient transportation? I want to get everyone on the same page here for those of you who might not know what this is. I'll then talk about decision-making and evacuations, followed by how we might be able to leverage shared resources in evacuations. And then I'll discuss a little bit of our ongoing research that we have with our RESUME group. All right, so what is resilient transportation? I have a very basic definition to get us all on the same page so that we know what we're talking about. So resilient transportation is really about the ability and the capacity of transportation systems, their infrastructure and associated non-infrastructure elements to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from either acute shocks or chronic disruptions. I want to be really clear here that sometimes we use the term resilience in other ways. We think of it, I'm a resilient person, I can be robust, I can be flexible. I can think about redundancy as another kind of synonym. But in this case, we are mostly interested in this idea of acute shocks and disruptions to our system. That's where resilience really starts to come into play. So there's four kind of areas I want to mention on what resilience can look like. And the first one and most, personal is at the individual level. Each one of you might feel some level of resilience to something that happens in your life, or perhaps it's to an event that is occurring. Perhaps it's the cold weather outside. You're resilient to the cold weather being in Canada. But it also goes a lot further. It also includes communities. How can a community be able to recover from a disaster? All the way to a system, which is what we're interested in, transportation systems, and also down to economy. The what is, I mentioned the shocks as well as the ongoing disruptions. Shocks you might consider your large-scale hazards. So think wildfires, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis. But stresses are going to be a little bit more ongoing events. Think last summer when we had all those different wildfire events, we had all that smoke pouring into Edmonton. That might be considered both somewhat of a shock because we had the wildfires, but the stresses are ongoing. That smoke lingers over periods of time, and this becomes very cyclical. We can also think of stresses as being climate-induced, so often sunny day flooding that occurs in some coastal communities due to sea level rise. There's also the when. So this is the disaster cycle in a nutshell. And so the disaster cycle has four phases to it. Preparedness, and then right in the middle of preparedness and response, we have a disaster, and then we have to respond to that disaster. Once we've responded, we go through a more recovery process, and we go through that time period, and then we finally come back to adaptation. The recovery's over, but we're trying to adapt to a better future. And finally, the how, there's two different approaches. We have an equilibrious approach and an evolutionary approach. Equilibrious says, let's get back to where we were before. Let's bounce back, let's recover back to the system that was functioning previously. Evolutionary is starting to gain a little bit more traction in the literature and the research, and that's a little bit more about how we can bounce forward. So it's not just back to where we were, but think about certain stresses and climate impacts that are going in the far future. This leads me to large-scale disasters, which is one of those acute shocks to our system and one things we have to deal with. And we're starting to see research has shown higher intensity and frequency of rainfall, heat waves, as well as different types of wildfire events that are somewhat climate-induced, but are also happening on just a regular basis without the effects of climate change. We've had wildfires in Canada for centuries, and so this is still an ongoing challenge that we have. But the reason why it becomes more of a challenge is that we build and we continue to build in high-risk areas. And so these are going to be places in which There might be these types of events happening. For example, this is a picture of cross in Kelowna. So this is wildfires in 2023. So the Kelowna area. So we are building in these places where we have these different types of hazards and events. And so what's going to happen is that we could have significant human and economic losses that are derived from these different types of events, specifically disasters. And there's also an expectation that this will rise with increasing climate change and the effects of that we're going to be seeing. I also wanted to make sure I mention right here is that this is a Sustainability Council event. And I wanted to mention that we're talking about resilience and not necessarily the other term, which is sustainability. So I wanted to connect this to some of our sustainable development goals, which are developed by the United Nations. So there's 3 in particular that are important for the talk that I'm going to mention today. The first is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. One of the first key objectives of this SDG is to develop resilient infrastructure. It's almost immediately right off the bat when it comes to different objectives. The one that is a little bit more encompassing is thinking about sustainable cities and communities. While it says sustainability within the SDG goal, there is a really strong emphasis on resilience and being prepared for any type of event that could impact the community. This also means about creating thriving cities and communities. And finally, climate action. One of the goals here, while it's a little less oriented towards communities and more oriented towards a little bit more ecosystem, it does say about adaptive and resilient goals in order to handle the effects of climate change on our society. And so there's a few other targets that are associated with some of the other SDGs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, but these are the key ones that I wanted to mention for this talk. So this brings us to the core concept that I want to talk about today, which is large-scale evacuations. And large-scale evacuations are the primary way that we safeguard people from a hazard. It is the #1 way and will continue to be the #1 way, because in the event of some of these catastrophic events, such as the Fort McMurray wildfires in Alberta, the only way to safeguard lives is to evacuate people. There are some instances where certain types of disruptions and disasters, you might be safer staying indoors, or you might be able to shelter in place. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking about disasters that require this mass exodus of people. And we've seen, for example, millions of people ordered to evacuate from hurricanes, particularly within the Gulf Coast, but we also have hurricanes on the eastern seaboard of Canada as well. And the big one, at least within the Alberta context, for those of you who might have been living, for example, in the province at the time, was the Fort McMurray wildfires in 2016, led to about 88,000 people being ordered to evacuate. So that's basically the entire municipality of Wood Buffalo in that area, along with a lot of the industry and oil sands operations up there also had to be evacuated. So my own research has found that over 1 million people had to be ordered to evacuate from California wildfires in just a 3-year span, which is quite dramatic. And even in the last summer in Alberta in 2023, we saw about 30,000 people ordered to evacuate. Now, these, of course, are just numbers, but think about the individual implications that has on someone's life. So each one of those people has a story to tell and a challenge that they experienced during that event. It's very disruptive when people go through these evacuations. And then, of course, we see evacuations from all different types of hazards, particularly flooding and wildfires within the Canadian context. And this is happening across a variety of different provinces. Even in 2023, we saw wildfires, for example, in Nova Scotia. That led to evacuations, but then we have flooding all across the other provinces as well. My own research has identified 3 critical evacuation challenges. So our goal again is to get people out, safeguard lives, but there's still problems that go along with that. And the ones that we've come across still are pretty difficult to solve. The first one being is non-compliance to mandatory evacuation orders. So when we have an evacuation, a government official or whoever's in charge is going to issue a mandatory evacuation order. Our goal is to ensure that people will comply with that order, because usually that order is given to safeguard, again, people's lives. But what happens is that people don't necessarily comply with that order. Now, it could be for a variety of reasons. Some of it could be because they are physically unable to evacuate. They might have a disability that makes it much harder for them to move and to evacuate. It makes it they're homebound, for example. For other folks, it could be economic reasons. They don't want to be far away from their job because if they're away from their job, they might not be able to come back and be able to pay the bills. They could also not be able to afford a hotel or motel where they might need to go. So there's a variety of reasons for non-compliance. This doesn't necessarily mean an individual choice that I will only do this. It is sometimes the circumstance that they're placed in that leads to that decision. The second is poor transportation response, and so this often is connected with congestion. We have congestion that arises from these events because if you think about it, an evacuation involves the peak of the peak demand on our transportation system. Think about commute travel. You might experience some traffic as a result of commute, but that's only a small subsection of the city that's commuting in the same direction, the same route. In this case, this is the entire city on the same route going in the same direction. And so this creates a lot of challenges. It can lead to slow evacuation clearance times and also high evacuee risk. And finally, the last challenge I want to mention is there's really not been a lot of attention ensuring that those most vulnerable have access, particularly to transportation resources as well as sheltering resources. And so this is really integrating social equity within our research. And this is going to come across in a few of the examples I'm going to give today, particularly on the sharing resources in disasters. And so we'll be chatting about that a little bit more. Okay, so that's the general sense on where we all stand today. Hopefully that got everyone on the same page on what I want to chat about. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more of the research and what results that came out of this and how we applied a human-centered approach to achieve those different results. The core question that we asked in this was, how do people make choices in disasters? How do people make choices? How would you make a choice in disasters? You can kind of think through that. How might you evacuate? What is concerning for you that you need to go through? So in the end, when we think about choice modeling, we have to deal with a number of complex decisions in a hazard. So those complex decisions include, do I evacuate or stay? That's the first question. Do I evacuate or stay? Second question, well, now what transportation do I figure out? What kind of mode of transportation? Do I have my own personal vehicle? What time do I leave? What route do I take? Is that dependent, for example, on the hazard? Is there a wildfire going through that route and I can't take that? I have to go somewhere else. It could also include destination. For example, where am I going? If I'm evacuating from Edmonton, am I going still within Edmonton or am I going to Calgary? Personally, I'm going to Calgary. I have friends there. And so you can think through some of these situations. And this leads to a number of other kind of researchy, more classic researchy kind of questions that we start to ask ourselves. Is first, how do people behave among these, and what influences some of these decisions? Are some of these decisions considered jointly? For example, well, wouldn't we expect that your shelter type, if you stay with a friends or family, is directly connected to the destination you're going? I have friends in Calgary, so therefore I'm going to stay at a friend's house in Calgary. So those two choices are very much connected to each other. Does heterogeneity exist in the population? Not everyone reacts the same. For example, you would expect to see maybe let's say a variable about professors and how they make choices in disasters. But does every professor make the same choice? No. Does every student make the same choice? No. But we often in our models say, well, all students have this general kind of influence and all students are going to generally do this, but there's heterogeneity that exists. People also might be making choices instead of maximizing their satisfaction. They might be minimizing their future regret. They don't want to regret something that they did that could lead to a really bad circumstance, meaning getting injured or putting your family, for example, at risk. And then finally, how do these choices inform evacuation planning? We always want to bring the research back to application and what that means for our communities. So how we go about this is through human-centered methods, specifically surveys. And so this is a little bit of a different kind of aspect of engineering that I want to kind of mention for those who are engineers in the room and online. We're going to be using revealed preference surveys that were distributed through a variety of different mechanisms, through local agencies, through community-based organizations. We were able to get a lot of different responses and through a lot of different hazards. We had Hurricane Irma in 2017, as well as 3 major California wildfires from 2017 to 2018. So we got a pretty good sample size out of that. You might be saying, well, these sample sizes seem kind of low. Well, they kind of are, that's true, but for the disaster world, this is pretty good. The reason being is that it's really, really hard to collect disaster information because people are recovering, and there's a lot of both logistical constraints, but also ethical considerations that we have to make when we survey people following a disaster. Their primary goal needs to be recovery, and if we're not providing that recovery, then we shouldn't be surveying them, for example. So surveys have a number of benefits and drawbacks. The first one is that on the benefit side, over to the left, is that it allows us to get both detailed and broad data. So we can ask very specific questions on specific choices, but we can also get a better sense of what people's comments are in the evacuation. What went well, what didn't go well. We can get that broad data as well. We can get a decently large sample size. Again, you can get small to large depending on your collection mechanisms. It can be analyzed in multiple different ways, which is beneficial for us, particularly as researchers. We can use basic descriptive statistics. We can leverage it through our discrete choice modeling, which I'll show, or we can even integrate it into other types of analyses like spatial temporal analyses and even machine learning. There's moderate in cost, which is good, but then there's a lot of drawbacks. And so this is kind of a limitations note for the lecture today. Is that we have limitations in our survey data in particular. First, there might be bias. It might be unrepresentative of the population that we're actually looking for. The people who might be more willing to fill out that survey might be just more plugged into their community, or they might have more experience with emergency management, and so they're on those channels. There's some memory and recall issues. So if it's too far away from the event, people might forget exactly what happened. This usually starts to occur a year after the event. But if you can get it within the year, you're usually okay, as long as you don't ask super specific questions, like what were you wearing on that day? But sometimes people remember that, which is pretty surprising. There's also intensive data cleaning, especially for non-responses. This becomes a major issue. What do we do with non-responses? And so there's different techniques that we're starting to kind of leverage within that. And then you also still may end up with the low sample size. So after all your effort, you might have lower sample size than you would like. So the prime methodology that we're using within this work is using discrete choice analysis. So discrete choice analysis, I like to kind of explain to folks who don't know it, is basically just a fancy regression. We're just trying to identify what could influence a choice. Just how we would try to identify in regression what independent variables affect a dependent variable. But the dependent variable in our case is going to be choice. So do I evacuate or stay? The influencers are going to be demographic characteristics, risk perceptions, context-dependent variables. The model selection for this is also context-specific. So there's a variety of different discrete choice models out there. The very basic ones are going to be your binary multinomial logit models. These are all just fancy terms, but in the end, it's just to denote that there are either two choices, binary or multinomial, more than two choices. We have mixed logit choices with mixed logit models, which help identify heterogeneity in the population. Same thing with latent class choice models. And then the one I'm going to highlight today is something called a portfolio choice model. I'll walk you through what that looks like and how that leads us to helpful results. And then there's also some more recent work. For example, some of my work has looked at multi-choice latent class choice models. That's really a mouthful. But really what it's saying is that we can identify groups of people that act in a similar way across choices as you keep kind of moving through all those different options. And from this, we can gain a better understanding of how people make choices. And from that, we can now start to inform evacuation plans, preparedness efforts, any type of resilience measures we might want to place. And I have an example of that as well. And this is an example of how the portfolio choice model is going to look like, all of these kind of different interactions and all the effects. So our goal is to, in mathematical terms, identify what is the strength of this interaction between the two. Which direction does it go? Is there directionality even? And what is the strength of that? And is it statistically significant? So through this, I've done a lot of work in this area. I just want to put these up just so that you know kind of where I'm drawing from. But the one I want to mention specifically is this dimensional dependency of evacuation choices. This is the one I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth in the next few slides. But I at least wanted to give resources in case you were interested in some of these other aspects of choice modeling research that exists out there within our space. But again, I'm not necessarily creating new methodology here. I'm using methodologies that we do have within the context of choice making and evacuations. I want to be clear on that. These are not my own creations, but I'm applying it in our unique case because we do need to understand people's choices. All right, so how does the portfolio choice model work? So you have a situation where you see this. Let's say this doesn't really look like Edmonton per se, but this is the best picture I can get. Let's say you're on vacation somewhere, or you're living in this location, and you see a massive wildfire over there, and you're like, this is not looking good. So you decide I need to evacuate. I'm a little concerned about this. Also, like the person next door said they're evacuating, so I'm going to evacuate. So once I decide to evacuate, what is your next thing that you're going to decide to do? What's your next thing you're going to decide to do? So maybe a show of hands. Who is going to decide where you're going next? Where you're going next, like your destination. Anyone? All right, a few people. Okay. What about your mode of transportation? What's maybe that one? Okay, mode of transportation. What about when you leave? No one? I got one on when you're going to leave. Okay. Anyone on route choice? Anyone on route? Yeah. All right, we got one on route. And so for those of you online who play along, you can start to see that you had a different choice than other people within the room, and that's going to be really important. The reason why all of these different choices are important is that we can't necessarily model them sequentially. What you would immediately want to do, and as what we have done as researchers, we want to do it sequentially because it's usually easier to do so. We say, all right, someone decides to evacuate, then they choose their mode, then they choose the destination, you kind of walk through each one. But the problem with that is that, as we just exhibited, not everyone is choosing it in the same order. So how about we just think about it holistically altogether? Let me give another example of how this might work. Let's say you're going on vacation, and let's say you you can determine the length of the vacation, what mode of transportation you use, and the type of housing. So let's say you could choose a long vacation or a short vacation. And you could choose different types of modes. You could fly there, you could drive there, or you could, if you're really crazy, you could bike. I actually wore my bike songs today just because, sustainability lecture, but also for this example. And you could bike, you could be that crazy person that bikes. If you have a long vacation, you're probably going to have a stronger preference to drive, perhaps, because you can do a nice long road trip. You have all this opportunity. I've done a number of road trips in Canada. It's been a lot of fun. And so you drive. You don't necessarily fly there. But if I only have a weekend, for example, I was just in California this weekend, then I have to fly. I'm not going to be able to drive. I don't have enough time. And I definitely can't bike. I cannot bike to California in a weekend. Good luck with that. But at the same time, there's also some potential connections and interactions with housing. So if I'm flying, maybe I need to stay in a cabin because I don't bring all my tent gear and everything. But if I am, for example, driving, I can bring my tent gear. Maybe I can tow, a trailer behind me. Maybe I can bring all of that, my camping stuff with me. So you might have a joint preference for these as well. And then you might even go further and say there's a dislike between a long vacation and this really cute cabin. Reason being is that you can't afford that really cute cabin, and so it's going to just take too much of your money to stay there. But you could maybe have a positive one going between these two, perhaps. What this ends up leading to is a series of portfolios in which you're making not just one decision, but you're making it all kind of combined as one. So when you make a vacation choice, you're not making it just as how long versus not. You're thinking about, well, what is my mode? Where do I want to go? If I'm going to Fiji, then I have to fly, for example. And this leads us to 12 portfolio options to choose from. And from this, we can mathematically identify joint dislikes, joint preferences, and whatnot. Within our wildfire evacuation standpoint, we did the same thing. We created these bundles. We created some on departure day, so that they were immediate versus non-immediate. Departure time by hour, in other words, in this case, night versus day. We also did it for evacuation choice. If people evacuate within the same county as their residence versus evacuating far away. County being here the US definition of county, since this is where the research was done. Mode choice, you could also divide mode choice into multiple categories. Shelter type is interesting because you get private versus public. So public is, I have to be around other people. Perhaps I have to pay for it versus not, but it's very different than staying with a friend or family. And then maybe your primary route by road type is different. So I take a highway versus not take a highway. And so those are kind of the different ways to think about it. So this leads to some results. When we model this and we identify the interactions that exist, we can start to see what affects different choices. So I'm going to tell a story here. This is a lot of numbers, but I'm going to try to tell a story so you can try to see how this works. So if you have a variable within county, which is the one highlighted in green, so those of you online, it's this bolded one that says same county as residents. In the Southern California wildfires, people are more likely to want to be within county or the same county as their residents. It's positive and it's statistically significant. That's really helpful for us. We know that people want to stay close to that fire. Now, let's watch this within county variable as it goes to an interaction. So let's interact that and all these other variables with each other and try to identify some statistically significant results. And what we can do is we can look at this example of interactions that exist. This is only a portion of the results. And you can see this within county again and night. There's an interaction between the two and it's positive and it's statistically significant. What this helps tell us is that there's a joint preference for evacuating within county and at night at the same time. Okay. Once you get to the car wildfire, you see that exact same interaction that exists. But then on the within county and private, it's not significant over here, but it is over here. So there's a joint preference for staying within county and staying with a friend or family. Kind of makes sense. But there's a joint dislike for within county and highway by that negative sign right there. And then again, it's statistically significant. So what does this all mean from a little bit more of a regular language standpoint instead of a bunch of numbers on the screen? What this tells us, so I just brought these back in to be a little bit clearer. What this says is that within county and night, people want to stay closer when it's nighttime. That's not too surprising. That makes logical, intuitive sense. They also might be hoping to go home. That's usually the biggest reason is they want to kind of stay home. They want to stay close, and if they can go home, they can go home because no one wants to sleep in not their own bed. So you might want to stay close within that during this high risk time, especially at night. It's not fun driving at night. You might be concerned about smoke, having that kind of challenge. There's also this within county and private I mentioned, and the key here is that there might be strong social networks within the county. I assume that most of your friends are probably, at least some of your friends are here in Edmonton. So you have that strong connection. You might even have family here, especially if you grew up in Edmonton. But you're going to have probably stronger connections with people here than you are going to have stronger connections with people, for example, in another country, perhaps. And at least being willing to go there for an evacuation. It'd be kind of hard to evacuate to another country at this point for an evacuation. And then within county and highway, we have a negative impact. And this really tells us that there's no need to travel on highways if you're staying close. You just take your local roads. This, again, makes logical, intuitive sense. But what we're starting to see is some of these patterns arise, and we can start to identify what really matters and what's really driving choices. We can also identify who are the people who actually want to stay within county versus not, which is also helpful for us. So we can get these variables. For example, if you have a higher degree for the car wildfire, we saw that people were less likely to stay within county and they wanted to kind of go a little further away. For the Southern California wildfires, we found these two variables as being significant. Living in residence for more than 10 years was positive and significant, which really shows that there's stronger connections within your community and perhaps also a desire to protect or defend their homes. And that really is kind of that place attachment that exists. So you want to stay within county. I know this place so well and I can get around really easily. And then there was also the impact of the Thomas fire, which was negative. That was a really large fire and had a lot of impact across multiple different counties. So if your impact is specifically from that fire, then you're more likely to go out. And that's because it was just such a large fire. So what does this tell us for policy? How does this help us in evacuation planning? Well, the first key aspect is that when we think about these variables together, what this tells us is that we need to be thinking about deploying our traffic management resources locally, at night, and perhaps even at the really immediate high risk time. Now, this all sounds intuitive for all of you, but it's really hard to mobilize resources at night because people aren't working as much. And perhaps this fire starts at 10 p.m. So you have a kind of a lag in communication. You might not be able to get resources deployed as quickly, but perhaps we deploy this in advance of an event, but it's ready for these nighttime evacuations and specifically being local. The other one is the within highway and within county, and this also kind of confirms that same aspect before, is let's focus on these short distance evacuees who need to get out of their neighborhood first. That's kind of that's a priority. Yes, there might be congestion on the highway, but our priority needs to be the folks who are in those high-risk neighborhoods who need to leave more immediately. And you can think about these more kind of strategies on local roads. All right. And so there's a lot of different evacuation planning options that we have available to our disposal. We have demand side strategies, for example. We have supply side. The interesting ones on the supply side in particular are contraflow and shoulder usage. It's making use of our existing infrastructure and being able to temporarily increase capacity. But we also have other options. Signal priority. Let's get all of our signals going the right direction. It might be employing a public transit strategy. So a lot of these are perhaps make sense to a lot of you, but a lot of times it's just so hard to deploy them, or you don't even know where to deploy a turn restriction. How do we do that? We have to do that in advance. We can't do it well in the next 10 minutes. So the key results from a lot of this work, and not just what I presented, but a little bit more, is first is that mandatory evacuations, and this is from some of the other research that I've conducted, they are really helpful. They help us increase compliance to evacuations, and they help us especially encourage people who are evacuation reluctant to be able to leave. We also saw in our case in this example that people make choices jointly, and this behavior has to be reflected in our transportation strategies, and it can help inform us on how better to meet the needs of people during this process. And finally, there are nuances in behavioral understanding. So I chose a portfolio choice model, but if you modeled that using a different type of modeling technique, you might come up with slightly different results. It might be similar in general themes, but there might be specifics that are different, which really shows that all models are somewhat inaccurate, but some are useful. And so the goal of the modeling is to really understand the behavior, but to do it in a way that is useful for evacuation planning. All right, so that's decision making. I now want to switch gears into another aspect of using human-centered approaches, but I want to do it from a different angle. So the key question here is, how do we share resources in disasters, and are people even willing to share resources? So we've already figured out that we have all these challenges that exist, but how do we improve the situation by perhaps sharing resources? So this has really been brought on by the sharing economy. There's a new feasibility that exists within the sharing economy to leverage emerging mobility for evacuations. And this has been really enabled through, well, our technology, our smartphone adoption, communication mechanisms, as well as sharing economy platforms. So think Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. These did not exist 20 years ago. And so when you now have these different connections, we're now starting to think about how can we leverage just existing capacity in vehicles. There's not been much exploration into a lot of these areas. There's been a little bit of work by myself as well as a few other researchers in this area. But it's really starting to take off and really showing what is the value of shared resources. And I really want to emphasize here is that our goal is not to supplant public resources. Our goal is to supplement and leverage existing company resources and resident resources in addition to what we have in the public. So I'm not saying here, let's not have public transit at all. What I'm here to say is that we need supplement resources just because we need all of it. So we do the same thing here. I have surveys again, as well as focus groups. In this case, our focus groups are geared towards underserved populations. So I had one focus group on older adults, one on individuals with disabilities, one on lower income individuals, and one Spanish speaking only. And that was conducted in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but we had someone to conduct the research for us. So in this focus group kind of section, we have a number of drawbacks as well as benefits by doing these focus groups. So one of the key benefits is that we hear people's stories. And I want to emphasize this particularly for engineers who are here in the room as well as online, is that hearing people's stories is extremely valuable for us because in the end, people are interacting with engineering systems as well as infrastructure. So we get these stories, we also get a lot of detailed data. We actually hear directly, well, this is why I made this choice. And that's much better than necessarily a survey. We can do highly tailored and probing questions. And again, this is a great opportunity to talk with underserved populations who we might not be able to find in our surveys. The drawbacks, though, kind of hard sometimes to conduct certain analyses. We can't do quantitative analyses, for example. It's just a little harder and our sample sizes are a lot lower. Also, you need a lot of training for moderation, and they're really hard to organize. Really, really hard to organize. If anyone has done focus groups, you know the kind of the time commitment that exists for that. So the research that I've done on this kind of topic has been really fourfold again, but the ones I want to emphasize are how people are influenced to share, and what are the equity benefits and limitations of sharing. So here's an example for all of you, is you've been ordered to evacuate from a wildfire. How willing would you be to give someone a ride in the following situations? So how willing would you be? So situation 1 is before evacuating. Situation 2 is while evacuating. You give it some thought, think, well, what would this depend on? Am I going to be willing? The other scenario is you have not been ordered to evacuate from a wildfire. How willing are you to provide a place for someone to stay at, specifically your place, and provide a bed for them? And the two scenarios there are they have to pay you, or they can just stay for free. So you're charging them or not. So you're thinking through what would you do. It probably might be dependent on who you're sharing with, for example. But when we asked this question to people who had just been through a wildfire, what we found was that people were actually pretty willing to share. So this is very / extremely willing to share. So this is like the highest group. They're like, yeah, I'm definitely going to do it. Totally going to do it. It's going to be great. And we see that for shelter for costs, not great. People don't really want to charge people. That kind of makes sense. You probably don't want to charge people. It seems kind of mean, especially in a disaster. Shelter for free, much better. But then if you go to transport before and transport during, between hurricanes and wildfires, we see a decent jump from shelter. But we also see more people sharing within the wildfires case. And these are people who are just impacted from a wildfire. So this is what you would do in the next disaster. We also found that despite this very strong willingness, there was even higher rates of capacity. People just had this capacity. So there's obviously a gap between what people have versus what people are willing to give. And that makes kind of logical sense. And so we found that a lot of people have spare beds, but they're not necessarily willing to share. And there's a lot of spare capacity in terms of seatbelts. This was actual spare capacity in particular from when people evacuated. We asked them, how many spare seatbelts did you have when you evacuated? And this is what they gave. So really interesting. So what did this all lead to? All this survey data enabled us to identify these binary load models. I'm not going to show the models just for time's sake, but they're available in papers. One of the key, though, results that came out of this was that people who had high trust and compassion, self-reported, but had high trust and compassion for other people, were more willing to share their resources. And this was the case for all 4 sharing scenarios for both wildfires that we looked at. So it wasn't some fluke. We had a lot of models going on. We were like, oh, I was actually, in my perspective, I was very surprised on how strong it was. I thought it was like, oh, maybe a few models, a few cases might impact it, but it was really important. And to really emphasize how important this elements of social capital exist, we did a sample enumeration where we said, well, what if the entire population was very high trust and compassionate versus a population that was just didn't really trust each other at all? What would be the rates of willingness to share? And you can see just the gap on some of these. Like, for example, transportation before evacuation, just the percent of people who'd be willing to share just drops off like crazy for these lower trust and compassionate situations. And so it really, I think, drives home how when we build social capital within communities, we can start to at least encourage people and see their willingness to share. We tested a lot of other variables. I'm going to just very briefly go through this. Interestingly, insignificant was capacity. So it didn't matter if they had capacity. It was still, it would end up being significant. We also saw some urgency variables as being more willing to share, less willing to share might be previous evacuees, as well as families with children in the household. So this then brings us to a few other kind of results, and then I'll start to wrap up. So a few of the results that we got from the focus groups. So those were all survey results, but the focus groups were really helpful because we actually heard directly from vulnerable populations on what their needs were and what their concerns were. And what we found is that these different vulnerable groups were very concerned, for example, with availability and reliability. They were also concerned that vehicles couldn't even get to the evacuation zones. Would they show up? If I contacted an Uber driver, would they show up to my destination? There was concerns about cost and communication that exist as well. And then each one of our groups also had a distinct concern. So the older adult group was saying, this is too complicated. I don't want to deal with this. I just want public transit to come pick me up. The lower income said, well, drivers aren't incentivized to show up. So why would Uber driver show up to come to get me if I'm not incentivized? Individuals with disabilities were worried about vehicle accessibility. For example, is this pickup truck acceptable for an individual with a disability? Probably not. And then Spanish speaking just had very low trust of companies, which was kind of a problem. So you can see here through by actually asking people directly and sitting in a group with them that we can get some really detailed results, more so than what we got from the models. From the models, I just said, well, trust and compassion. Well, this is actually looking at distinctive barriers that exist for those specific groups. And there were a number of suggestions that participants actually made without being prompted, which was very nice of them. And they said, well, I would prefer a robust transit-based plan first, and then thinking about shareability. I'd like to create partnerships ahead of time for paratransit, instead of necessarily going shareability first. So this would be considered, again, a complementary strategy, not a primary strategy. We also did the kind of an analysis where we looked at 18 different vulnerable groups and their different opportunities and challenges. This is a lot going on this slide, but I want to mention in particular for challenges that might be hard to locate individuals. You might have a digital divide where people don't have access to technology, or you might even have high liability. So if I provide that service and something goes wrong, what happens to me as that provider? Am I covered under, for example, Good Samaritan laws? I don't know. That's kind of a key concern. This was an example that we came up with each of these vulnerable groups, the definition and all these challenges, as well as recommendations. I want to pull out this older adult one in particular, so we can see some benefits and opportunities here. So this could increase the amount of resources, increase accessibility, enhance social connections, and ensure compliance. So that's the check mark. But there's challenges, in particular liability and the digital divide, which I mentioned, but also making sure that people who provide assistance, they might not be trained for assisting an older adult in that situation. So the recommendation here is training programs can be really very helpful, and that this group of older adults is actually probably one of the most easily benefiting from the shared resource kind of strategy. So key takeaways from this section is first, companies have acted in disasters and continue to act. Those first three, Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb, have been acting for over a decade now, and they continue to do so. We also found that if you have high levels of social capital, in other words, trust and compassion, you are more willing to share. And we can leverage that by ensuring and trying to increase social capital ahead of time so that it can lead to more sharing in the future. Sharing differences do exist among these different communities of high and low trust. And we also found that if people experience urgency in their wildfire evacuation, they might be more willing to share, which is also helpful for us. So in that moment, when I'm sitting there and saying, well, if I don't help my neighbor, then they could die, that is really the time in which we need to be encouraging sharing as much as possible. Multiple disadvantaged groups could gain considerable benefit from a lot of this strategy, but obviously a lot of barriers remain. And the other key aspect is that there is demand for resources and there is definitely willingness, but how we connect those is going to be challenging. Sure, we can go through a company platform like Uber and Lyft, but does everyone have Uber and Lyft? Does everyone want to use that? The Spanish-speaking group would say, no, we do not want to use that. We don't trust companies. So that's, again, where that human-centered approach is helpful for us. All right, I'm just going to wrap up here on a few other notes. First is just ongoing research. What do we have going on at the University of Alberta on these human-centered approaches? So the big one that we have is resilience hub design and analysis. We're looking at how we can use resilience hubs, which can be useful for both disasters as well as normal conditions. And we're trying to figure out, well, what will people use these resilience hubs? How will they travel to the hubs? And what, again, are the influencers of these choices to hub design? And that's specifically within Edmonton. We actually just wrapped up that project, and we're really looking forward to sharing the results from that. And then we're looking at kind of 3 elements of different modes. So we have urban evacuations of public transit use, micromobility, and resilience of electric vehicles. So kind of thinking beyond what I shared today, which was mostly vehicles, well, let's think about how we might be able to leverage, especially in urban evacuations, micromobility. If we are to get our sustainable transportation goals, especially since this is the Sustainability Council, then we need to think about people who don't have access to a car, or who either can't afford access or who choose not to have access to a car. And so these are kind of projects within that space. We're also looking at wildfire evacuations in Canadian communities as well as abroad. So looking at Australia and the United States as well, and comparing these different behaviors, which will be really interesting moving forward. And most recently, we're going to be doing an analysis on the 2023 Alberta wildfires, as well as travel behavior in different types of smoke events. So as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this presentation on kind of one of those chronic disruptions, that's going to be travel behavior in smoke. So just to conclude, the goal of this presentation was to hopefully expand your kind of concept of sustainability to also start to consider the resilience aspect. And if we're going to create thriving communities of the future, we need to consider the effect of disasters on our communities. Resilient transportation plays a key role in that, but we can't understand resilient transportation unless we understand people's behavior. Behavior is one side of the transportation coin. You have demand, which is behavior, and supply, which is the actual transportation system. I also hope that this was a little helpful for engineers in the room and online, that this was a little bit kind of rethinking what engineers can do, and what we probably should be doing a little bit more is working directly with people and asking these important questions, because in the end, our goal is to help people. And so that should be the core of our research questions. And connection to planning and response, this of course is still ongoing, but we need to be building these evacuation plans as we move forward. So with that, I want to acknowledge some of the very important people, my advisors on a lot of this work. A lot of it was done at UC Berkeley. Susan Shaheen, Joan Blocker, Casper Porras, and Adam Pell, fantastic advisors, wonderful people, and really guided me through this research. Also, a lot of this organization affiliations, a lot of it was conducted at UC Berkeley, but some components were finished up here at the University of Alberta, as well as the ongoing research, which we're very excited about. And of course, the funders of this research as well, we want to thank them. And finally, we want to thank the research partners. There were so many amazing organizations that helped us out with survey distribution, over 80 in California and over 10 in Florida that were just so impactful for us. And I also have to throw this up for the Resume group. This group of individuals is fantastic. And I'm really thankful for all their hard work on this, and especially on this ongoing research at the University of Alberta. I really do think that the future is very bright for not just the Sustainability Council, but for resilient transportation as really a field. So with that, I'll end, and thank you so much for coming.